So yeah, you're talking about your grandma and just being poised and elegant and even on the phone, huh?
Yeah, grandmother was an incredibly poised, elegant woman. And, these are the days before caller ID. So you never know who's calling you at
Mhm.
home.
No,
It could be, one of her husband's superior officers,
sure.
that like it could have been anybody. So, my mother did this thing where she, and I looked this up, I found out how they did it because she didn't remember, but at the time it was incredibly easy to use someone else's
Oh
credit
yeah, that
card to
little
call long
code. That was
distance.
interesting to me. Yeah.
Yeah, because she said, well, I use these credit card numbers. And I would say, in interviewing my mother for this project, I have to say was so interesting because I really committed to kind of treating her like a source. So
Hmm.
instead of just letting her tell me stories, I doubled, I tripled back. I
Yep.
asked for confirmation, I asked for more details, I really pushed on things. And I said, where did you get credit cards
Hmm.
from? Thinking like, that sounds like I was like, did you steal someone's credit card? She said, oh, no, 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 no. It was just a thing that everybody knew how to do. Kids would teach each other.
Hmm.
And so I did some research and I found it that, yeah, like,
Hmm.
anarchist theater troops used to have like little skits and stuff, little songs that they would do about
Uh,
this. It would be on flyers. It was like basically like, not just runaways but hippies and all sorts of like counterculture types were really
hmm.
like, this was the age of like phone cards essentially, right?
Okay.
You had like that long distance phone card that was a credit card, but also you use that number to make long distance calls to charge it to your card. And
Hmm.
they all, because they didn't realize how this was like how you quote unquote, like, this is how you could get one over on Ma Bell.
Hmm.
All of these numbers, like, they followed a very predictable numerical scheme.
Okay.
So you could just plug this one preface number in, and then like any sort of like 4 or 5
Ah.
digit combo, and you could probably get through.
So some guy in Idaho maybe got charged for
Yes.
that call. Huh.
Absolutely. Yeah. So kids
Ah.
did this, young people did this all the time, and they taught each other how to do it. She would call just to hear, I think just to hear her mother's voice. But she never wanted to say where she was. She would call and she would hang up.
Yeah.
And I do wonder if grandmother knew that that was my mother, or maybe she thought, well, it's a prank call or a wrong number,
Hmm.
or what have you. But she had the boys at home, my uncles, and during my mother's first time running away, this was, one of the reasons why is granddaddy was in Vietnam. He
Right.
was an officer in the army. He volunteered to go back for a second tour, which was, I think, maybe not a popular option at home. Like, I don't think grandmother
Uh-huh.
wanted him to do that.
Hmm.
Obviously, if he had the choice, why would he go back into an active
Sure.
war? But it was easier to get promoted when you volunteer to do
Hmm.
hard things. And his career as an officer in the army was their ticket to the middle class, the upper middle class then
Hmm.
too. They, neither of them grew up with much. And so that was still at the time where you could kind of work your way up, work your way into officer training, from being an enlisted man. And he really took advantage of that, and built a life for them. So also she was dealing with not living on a base with that sort of built-in support,
Hmm.
having two, adolescent and teenage boys at home that she had to look after, and having a husband away at war. And so I think I definitely, what I picked up on growing up, because I had my grandparents, were alive until I was a young adult, and actually my
Hmm.
grandfather didn't pass away until 2007.
Hmm.
um, was that they were, you know, they still treated the runaway period of my mother's life as a bad thing that she did, as her fault, that
Hmm.
she kind
Okay.
of ruined some things for herself, and it was a little shameful for the family.
Hmm.
And even though they reconciled, and we were very close, like I said, but I do feel like my mother spent the rest of her parents' lives trying a lot of ways to make it up to them.
Hmm.
And so I kind of grew up with that understanding that, like, if you have this kind of um if you have this kind of like intellect, and if you have this kind of grit and work ethic and the backing of a family that wants you to succeed and do great things in life, then like the worst thing that you could possibly do is mess that up by acting out.
Right.
That's a very reductive way to put my family situation, but I internalized that from a very early age. And so, I write about this, about sort of becoming the overcompensating, achiever, good girl.
Yes.
In a lot of ways, because I sort of thought, I don't want to be, this sounds so terrible, but like, I don't want to turn out like my mother, that's like 14-year-old me thinking. I want to go to college and finish college, on the traditional path, and nothing's going to stop me from doing that. That's really what I felt. And I think on a level that I didn't quite understand was that my mom's investment in that for me as well, I think ended up having a lot to do with like, listen, she was a young mom, I was the second kid too. My brother's 2 years older than me. She was a young mom, but she was going to have good kids. So I think that was one way for her to kind of show the world that like, don't underestimate me and what I can do. So, my brother and I were well behaved if it killed her, especially in public. Like we were not the tantrumy kids. We were not, she wasn't like the kind of pop culture young mom who was like our best friend. It was almost the opposite, I think, because that's maybe what people expected of her, that she was going to be like the cool hippie mom and be very permissive and have these like wild little children running around. And like, no, we were always dressed neatly, hair brushed and cut, and reading early, and impressed that we, this is the straight path through was going to be the one that was going to be best. So I did also sort of feel that like responsibility to her as well. Those expectations that were put on us, they felt very real to me. And I don't think that I ever seriously considered rebelling against them. Until I really had the luxury of doing it to myself as an adult with my own self-supporting, now I guess I can sabotage myself as much as I want. But yeah, that was the feeling kind of growing up, and it had everything to do with like my grandparents' expectations for my mother.
Yeah.
And how those were then sort of transferred largely to me. Yeah.
Going back to like the first chapter has some incredible lines. The first line of the book pretty much is, of all the lies I once believed about my mother and father, the biggest was the one I told myself. Right. And then as you start to write about kind of like the quote unquote origin story as the daughter of Woody Allen's Manhattan, you like to think of yourself that way. And then but a great line that talks about women in general, but I guess specific to that movie is, quote, a girl becomes visible to the world, stories like Manhattan taught me, when a man appears next to her in the frame. That's deep.
Oh, thank you.
All right. And then so you're talking a lot about art, and Woody Allen, he's an artist, and this is the ideas of creating great art through empathy and sympathy for those who make bad choices. And like, okay, well, he's just making art. And then like you talked about earlier, like that thinner line as the years have gone on between the artist and the art, right? And you ask on page 25, what do you do with art from a disgraceful and a disgraced artist, right?
It's a big question right now. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess to just again to basic what's in the art as well as what was in your real life, this idea of like that you believed, maybe past tense, you believe that like your mother and your father's life was quote unquote saving him, or maybe you were saying that was what she believed.
Yeah, I mean the big lie was that was something that men sort of did put on girls, women, and then by an extension then the family, the kids that he had. Yes, we were supposed to like redeem existence for him.
Where would I be without you, right?
Exactly right. Yeah. That we were supposed, and this, as I sort of later then kind of learned and unpacked, definitely there were folks on my dad's side who, if they didn't know exactly how old she was, kind of knew that something was not adding up there. You know, like I said, my mother was not a master of disguise. And when I look at now at like their wedding photos, she just does really seem so, she's very tall and very beautiful and very young.
Mm.
But that like there was this idea that he had, you know, he had been so wayward, right?
Right.
Even though he has so much promise, and this idea that like he could have this anchor in his life, this stability, you know, somebody to people, a family to provide for, that this would be the magic ingredient that was going to make him into a more stable, productive person, that, you know, that we were going to transform him almost like a fairy tale, you know, into a quote, you know, I guess what you would consider a better man. In that same way that like in the end of Manhattan, you know, the Isaac character is listing all of those things that make the pain of existence, you know, bearable, and lands on Tracy's face in that same way that you would list, you know, another thing that you could buy. Essentially, it's really terrible. It's really terrible when I look at it now. But that she, you know, this idea that this young girl who has her whole life in front of her, who really should not be dating this man her father's age, has decided to put all of this on her. You know,
right. What a burden, right?
Right, and how unfair to her, and how just, I guess, like fundamentally, this is such a, it's almost a silly word to use, but how immature, really.
Sure.
You know, just like I want, and that's what I want. And to say that basically you're the thing, a thing, really, like you're the thing that's going to make life okay, as if it's her responsibility to make his life okay.
Right. Well, I mean, talking about like object, I mean, you write about in kind of the next couple chapters about how like objectivity towards your father is an impossibility, which is definitely understandable. And you know a lot about his odyssey with like the narco farm and trying to get clean from heroin mostly, right?
Yeah.
And you know another great quote is this: the belief that the past must be prequel was a hard one to shake. I don't remember exactly how, but you'd written kind of about survivor's guilt.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to that question, that sort of fundamental understanding of if, and of course is the big if, which I've now come to understand is a faulty assumption, but if we were supposed to be the thing in his life that was going to save his life, and we didn't, like what, you know, this growing up with this feeling, you know, he so, you know, for listeners, spoiler, what happened is that my mother left him and she moved in with her parents. And at this point, grandmother and the colonel had left the DC area. He worked for the Pentagon at the end of his military career and retired. They retired to Arizona. And so she moved us all the way across the country, away from Jersey, to Arizona. And while we were there, they never divorced. This wasn't, you know, this was really in the span of about a year. His health took a turn for the worse. He never stopped drinking, even though he did successfully kick heroin with the help of the methadone program in New York City. But you know, his health took a deep turn for the worse, and I don't know what all he was, you know, if it was alcohol abuse during that last year specifically, or if there were other things. I just don't know. But he ended up in the hospital dying, and she went back east to as that was happening, and he died while she was there. So you know, the idea that like your family, your children, your wife, it could be enough to take somebody who has this problem, who has this addiction, and who also at the same time has a lot of other anger issues and entitlement issues that that made him, you know, drive his family away too. That we were supposed to be enough though to save him, and that we weren't. And that was I think a hard thing for me to unlearn and to see a little more distance, and really diving deep into the material of my family, that's an improper burden to put on other people.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what an incredible burden to put on anyone, but to put on a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 13-year-old as you grew up. Wow.
Yeah. And I mean, some of that was just something I think that I absorbed, you know, in the atmosphere and put on myself. So, you know, it's quite possibly there was some of that that I just sort of melodramatically intuited, you know. But you have to think, like, when you do sort of feel abandoned by a parent as a child, I think most children ask themselves at some point whether, you know, whether intentionally or just deeply rooted question of, did I cause this somehow? Is this somehow my fault?
The next couple of chapters are more generally about like the epidemic of runaways. I mean, unfortunately, I don't know that stopped. You know, in the early 70s, around the time that your mom did so from Kansas originally. Incredibly interesting and gruesome and all the above, about like the Sandy at the Smithsonian.
Yeah. So, you know, one thing that I was struggling to understand was, what was the wider context that my mother ran away in, right? How is she, I had some big questions that were guiding the writing of this book. And one of my big questions was, how'd she stay gone for so long?
Yeah.
Like, to, you know, how do I understand that as somebody who came of age during, like, you know, if you were a missing kid, you were on the back of milk cartons from the supermarket. And then later there were entire TV shows dedicated to, you know, to trying to reunite families and to find missing kids. It was really treated differently. So I had to do a lot of research about that. And the Runaway Youth Act of 1974 was a big game changer in how the government and really thought about and conceptualized runaways. And, you know, I think we all know this, like, federal legislation doesn't just come out of thin air. It's often it's a long and laborious process, and it's almost always in response to a problem of some sort, right? Like, so this had been a problem for many years. And there had been congressional hearings and, you know, subcommittee interviews and stuff. There's a lot of material to sink through, and several people wrote books about it around the time. And so Christine Chapman wrote this great book called America's Runaways, you know, and she found out about this. She wrote about this in this book that came out in like 1976. And one of the stories in it that really fascinated me was the idea that there was a runaway girl skeleton that the Smithsonian's anthropology department had in their possession. Because I think about museums having, you know, my idea of like what sort of skeletons might a museum have are like more sort of archaeological, right? You know,
of course.
Yeah, old stuff,
right?
Fossils,
mastodons, or something, you know.
Exactly, yeah. And so I became a little lightly obsessed for a while with like seeing if I could, you know, was this still there this many years ago. So it was an interesting process trying to get some straight answers from some folks at the Smithsonian this many years later, right? And they really tried. They were very polite, and it really just kind of turned. At some point, I think maybe there was like, maybe we shouldn't have, you know, I'm assuming attitudes about these sorts of things change over time. You know, at the time, the Smithsonian was very like, wow, you know, we don't usually have this kind of intact, young, relatively recent, quote unquote, I'm just going to, you can't see my finger quotes, but specimen, you know. And I think now there's this awareness also that like, this is somebody's family member, this is somebody's child, this is a cold case still, you know, that maybe it shouldn't just be part of this collection. So it's somewhere, but I ended up talking, you know, emailing with this medico-legal death investigator about this, who's hooked me up with the number for the missing persons database that I could go in and kind of take a look at. And that really, you know, it did make her feel real in a way that that I guess I was looking for also. And, you know, my mother, when she read the part about Sandy in the book, got really reflective, and she's really sad about it too. She's like, you know, she was out there on the East Coast the same time my mother was. She's like, my mom is like, was this somebody that I, you know, spent an afternoon with at some point? Or because kids would just come and go very fluidly, you know, in these scenes. She's like, at one point asked herself, like, is this somebody that I failed, that I could have saved? Which is, again, a huge burden for another, you know, a 13-year-old to put on herself about a fellow teenager just out there. Yeah, but really I looked at Sandy as like, that's the could have been also. So she does kind of haunt the story. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's such a microcosm, you know, of the greater issues, you know, about how easy it is to slip away like your mom did, you know, how Sandy did. This idea that, you know, the guy that she'd been with, that Sandy had been with, you know, he quote unquote seemed nice, right? So there weren't a lot of people who pried when they should have, or asked the questions. And, you know, a big question throughout the book is, you know, what is the difference between a missing kid and a runaway?
Yeah.
And, you know, there's not that there is one right answer. You write things that, like, you know, a runaway is quote unquote not a good girl, according to, you know, tropes and such. And, you know, she has agency. And, you know, the idea of how your mom fits into that. There's a really interesting story about, you know, your who became your stepdad, right?
Yeah.
You know, not doing nothing wrong, seems like a really good guy. You know, he was at the border, the US-Mexico border, and you wrote, quote, another way a girl disappears is the time she first understands that her truth matters less than a man's comfort. Right? Because you'd spoken up and said, you know, he's not my father, which was true at the time.
Right.
And he was just trying to make it easy, and, you know, he wasn't trying to do anything shady.
Yeah.
But yeah, just that idea of like, oh my, that is such a true statement. The time that a girl, you know, the time that she first understands that her truth matters less than a man's comfort says so much.
Yeah, you learn, I think girls, it's probably still, but definitely when I was a kid, learned from a really early age that, like, to read the room, to make sure that your needs or your truth wasn't too at odds with what needed to happen to keep things running smoothly.
Exactly.
People just didn't, you know, there was a lot of kind of like, I really didn't want to hear it. And I feel connected in that way to my mother too, who had a deep amount of pain that she was, I think, running away, you know, in some cases was maybe an attempt to be seen in absentia even, you know, if you can't, if I don't feel seen right here in front of everybody's face, then you know, maybe this is one way of making my needs known, is to remove myself. And they were largely emotional needs, which I think that is something that, you know, we're not always prepared to really talk about, the seriousnshe and the severity of adolescent girls' emotional needs. That it's not necessarily, you know, she again, one of the big driving questions in this book, not just how did she stay gone for so long, but why did she leave in the first place? And I never really, you know, I cannot answer that definitively. There's my mother's answer that she would give, but it's been, you know, sort of rehearsed and honed over time. I think as somebody who's also been a 13-year-old girl, part of it was like, she made an impulsive decision that she then realized, decided, I guess I better stick with this. Seems better than going home and getting in trouble. And then the sort of gradual, like, the deeper you're into something, the harder it is to extract yourself from it. Sometimes, you know, teenagers make impulsive decisions that they then have, you know, lifelong repercussions. But also that, like, just because she didn't come from the kind of home life that I think would have been, you know, coded or presumed to be unstable, you know, like, oh, that, like, she was not I think what people would assume would be an at-risk kid, you know. But that, like, just because there are not external at-risk factors doesn't mean that, like, somebody who has, you know, that the stability that everybody sort of assumes is the baseline and enough for a family, doesn't mean that, like, there aren't emotional at-risk factors that might have no external reasons other than, you know, happiness, feeling safe in the world, things that are hard to put external factors around.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I mean, there's probably even your mother, right? Couldn't nail it down to one. If you were to get away from the rehearsed and the honed answers, she couldn't give you one specific, you know, one exact answer. And we don't get that from the book, but it's like, you know, you said the tone where, it's Grace Slick, Jefferson Airplane time. It's, hippies. She's in this small town where she was, where she's feels more alone, when she was more used to structure from the air bases and such. And then of course with her dad away, and you write about how she took like a completely silent, completely personal vow of nonviolence that nobody knew about
Yeah.
outside
I
of
mean,
her.
yeah, like I don't know if she was entirely quiet about it, but certainly nobody wanted to
Mm.
hear it,
That's a big difference,
that
right?
right. Oh wow, you and your vow of nonviolence. Like she's 13-year-old girl,
Yes.
But I do think that people underestimate 13-year-old girls, and the
Mm.
fact that she held on to that for as long as she could until she was hurt so badly that she decided, well, that really flipped a switch in her, and she decided she was never going to be that she was going to that like no matter what, she was going to be aware of her safety and fight for her safety
Yeah.
going forward. Yeah, this is my mother would tell me when we were growing up, if you start to ask like, but like, why did you run away from home? Because when you're a kid, you have those moments where
Of course.
like you think, oh, I'll show them, and you're mad at your parents, like I'm gonna run away, they'll miss me when I'm gone. It's
Mm.
sort of like in A Christmas Story when Ralphie is like, he's gonna leave and become blind and come back and everyone's gonna beg his forgiveness. Those sort of melodramatic fantasies you have, but my mother actually did it. And so I think, of course we wanted to know why. Why is the thing that we just sit around and like simmer over, but ultimately
Mm.
decide that sounds tough. Like, how did
Yes.
she do it? She would say, well, I had already missed Woodstock and I didn't want to miss anything else. And when you're when you're like a young kid and then a teenager, like that is a sufficient, satisfactory explanation, right?
Mhm.
I believed that line for a long time. I don't, when I started writing this book, I just decided I was just not going to believe that anymore. Like maybe that is what she would have said at the time as well, because it is sort of a 13-year-old's answer. But there's wanting to go to cool concerts, and there's leaving your entire home and family behind and staying on the road for months with no money and no connections. Like they're
Right.
not really comparable to each other. And that's when that was just another sort of myth that I grew up with that I really began to interrogate, was like, okay, but why really?
Hmm. Well, like you write later in the book, it's kind of like the credo of like journalists. What is it? If your mother says she loves you, even then check it out.
Check it out. Yeah. If your
Right.
mother says she loves you, check it out.
Second and third and fourth, corroboration everywhere, right?
I looked for it. Some of the things that are in the book were very hard to substantiate because
Hmm.
the other people who were there who might have been able to give, contemporaneous descriptions or confirmed details are either dead or, somebody she knew by a first name only, and like
Yeah.
tracking them down would be incredibly difficult. But I did, I was able to interview at least one friend who knew her as in the
Hmm.
Meghan period.
Like,
The Alexis period is very traceable because we still have good family friends from the New York days that,
mm.
that still call her Alexis, know her as Alexis. But it was that Meghan period, that first time she ran away from Kansas and was gone until and that was like summer and was gone until between
Mhm.
Christmas, New Year's, where things are a little, were much hazier and harder to track down, because that's also the time where she moved around a lot. When she left Kansas, she went to Aspen. From Aspen, hitchhiked to Boston. From Boston, went to New York, and then went home from there. And then they moved because Granddaddy came home from the war. That last time that she calls my grandmother, to hear her voice, she finally says hello. It's Christmas and she
Mhm.
misses her mom, and her mother says, well, you better get home because your father's coming home.
Mm.
She's been gone for months at that point, but I guess the main reason why I just did not buy I didn't want to miss any more of the counterculture stuff is that it's one
Mm.
thing to run away from home for a few days to go to a
Sure.
music festival and then you come home. A lot of kids did that, a lot of
Mhm.
kids hitchhiked. And one thing that I wanted to make clear in the book is that, people will say, but it was safer then to do that sort of thing. And
Mhm.
I think the story of Sandy and the stories of most of the runaway stories that I was able to tell who weren't my mom or her friends, we know about because they had tragic ends.
Right.
The New York Times archives are full of them, really.
Oh.
It wasn't safer. Hitchhiking was more widely practiced, but I wouldn't say that it was
No.
that it was safe necessarily. It was just that because more people did it, you had higher odds of not being picked up by a serial killer. But you definitely had a lot of danger that went into getting into, especially as a girl, getting into a stranger's car.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, so you read about your mom's, like you said, there are some really happy times and adventures, and her playing the part, whatever the different parts were, getting jobs, getting temporary housing, getting more permanent housing. And, and unfortunately, I mean, there were, like you talked about, there was a one man who basically tried to buy her, right?
Yeah, that was a pretty just hearing that scene. So even when she was practicing sort of all the safety rules that she would try, that she had been taught on the road by other kids hitchhiking, if you're a girl, hitchhike with a guy because he can help protect you, but also you make him seem less threatening to somebody picking him up, right? So he's more likely to girls are more likely to get picked up than guys, of course, but that comes with like a safety issue on both sides of things.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and so I mean, and unfortunately, I mean, she was a sexual assault or rape victim.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, even then, just in that you write about some of what you know about some of her shock or some of the immediate, aftermath, and she was even telling herself maybe she'd been lucky. It could have been worse. I mean, she did escape. And just there's, I mean, really moving parts where, later in your life, there's a situation where like a friend maybe you didn't know wanted to go out, and you were like, no, you thought you were being safe, and your mom was saying, no, go, 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 and you later kind of found out that it was like more like your mom wanted you to keep the other girl safe. Am I getting that right?
This was an episode from high school that I kind of didn't really, it didn't seem that earth shattering to me at the time. I think my mom and I had a fight about something typical mother-daughter, and I remember being really upset and I'd been crying and I was just in a bad mood, and a friend stopped by, and she had a license. I didn't drive in high school. But was like, hey, and she had these two guys with her that I didn't know the guys. I knew the girl, and she had these two guys with her that didn't go to our school and that I didn't know and didn't recognize, and just didn't really seem like, I don't know, like they seemed different somehow, and maybe just because they were strangers, but it wasn't a terribly big area. But she had said, hey, we're going to go out to the lake. We lived near a lake, do you want to come? And I thought I was grounded. Again, like my mother was very strict, and I'm sure I had mouthed off or something, and I believe I was grounded. And I said, well, I can't go. And then my mom was like, no, you should go. And this was unusual. This was unusual to me. And I thought she was, and of course, in my like adolescent head, my teenage brain, I thought, well, she's just trying to like butter me up now to show she's sorry, but I'm not going to fall for it. Like I was in a bad mood. I didn't think the boys were cute, like they, et cetera, et cetera. And I was really going to just be like, I don't feel like I don't want to go. And she all but like threw my coat on me and like pushed me out of the house basically. And at the time I remember thinking, this is weird.
Yeah.
Because normally it'd be like, Erin can't come and hang out. She's grounded. So and it was really only that hindsight thinking about when my mother started telling me when I was interviewing her for the book about the rules of hitchhiking. She's making sure that like my friend is not outnumbered in this car because, and I think, I don't know why this wasn't something that I never really asked the friend about, like, why did you come pick me up that day? And maybe all of this was instinct, and maybe all of it was overly cautious. Nothing weird happened on that outing.
Sure.
I don't remember the boys' names even or anything about them. Like it was all pretty forgettable day.
Right.
I probably sulked because I was in a bad mood, but at least I was there. And I think that like that was a moment of wisdom that my mother had, that an instinct that she thought, better. I think that the odds, of everyone being safe will be better if this girl has a friend with her.
Right. So like, I mean, accusers is not the right term, it's too strong of a term, but like you write about basically how a lot of times it's more about the accuser than the accused. right? It's these kind of things, like that story kind of says more about your mom
Yeah.
than it did about you. And like that reminds me of like that just horrible. I hate that trope so much. The trope of like the like the father who's like, oh, my daughter's not going to date until she's 47, and
Right.
right when the boy comes over, like I'm gonna be there with a baseball bat, and and I think
Yeah.
that's what I was thinking of when you wrote about that. It's like that tells me so much more about the accuser, I think, about the father kind of knowing, maybe what he was like or what he is like,
Oh,
right?
exactly. Yes, yes. That like every accusation is a projection, I think is one
Exactly.
of the things that people say. Yeah. But often, right, like people are always trying to tell you, I think we're always trying to tell each other about ourselves. And
Mm,
sometimes that does come out in the worries. And I thought it was interesting that, and it's maybe I don't know if this was calculated on my mother's part. Maybe it was all just operating on instinct.
mm,
Um, but she did definitely have a sense that like girls have to look out for each other, don't leave
mm,
it, like don't leave your friends behind.
mm.
That it was all about survival for her when she was our age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as the book goes on, I mean, it's about that survival. It's about, and a lot of the book, a lot of the rest of the book too, is a lot about the men as, I mean, all of the book is about the men as the object of admiration, or the man as the object of, like you talk about with your father, kind of like how he was the one to be saved, right? The one about your stepdad, which is an innocuous story, but about how comfort of a man always outweighs the suffering of a girl or of a woman. Talking about the Pogues, the band, there's the Gilmore Girls references, a lot of pop culture, I know. The Star Wars, and the book ends with, and I'm glossing over a lot of things. I want people to really enjoy those parts. There's so much going on there. That Fitcher's Birds song that you referenced along with the Pogues is enough for a book on its own. Man, I got to check that out. That sounds like a dark and deep and disturbing one. But
Oh, Fitcher's Bird. Yeah. It's
yeah,
a one of those Brothers Grimm fairy tales
it is
that
Brothers
like,
Grimm. Okay.
yeah, yeah. So each of those fairy tales that are woven through the fairy tales of New
Hmm.
York chapter are actual fair, just like my sort of interrogation of, and sort of my version talking
Yeah.
through these versions of these fairy tales that are all about like why is it that like why is it so much easier for men to be remembered than girls
Mm-hmm.
and women, who
Mm-hmm.
gets their name on what,
Yeah.
which statues or which stories. And yeah, and even like a story as I love the Pokes and I love Shane McGowan, but like seeing Kata Reardon live was a transformative experience for me,
Hmm.
because it did make me really think like the tendency that we have, to which goes back to, in a different sense, John Lennon and Yoko Ono as well, that like